Microbial Metabolism, Part 3. As you recall from the discussion on glycolysis, at the end of glycolysis we've produced pyruvic acid, ATP, and NADH. Now some organisms are going to use that pyruvic acid for additional metabolic processes called fermentation. Some alternatives would be the TCA cycle plus cellular respiration, which we'll talk about in Part 4. But for now, let's look over some of the different kinds of fermentation pathways that different microorganisms can use for growth and reproduction. This is an excellent summary slide of the 6 different fermentation pathways that we need to know about for Exam 2. I recommend using this as a study guide or a study aid, and the following slides simply break down each individual pathway and its unique end products.
Also be sure to learn the names of the different example bacteria for each fermentation pathway. Lactobacillus and Streptococcus for lactic acid, Saccharomyces for the ethanol fermentation pathway, Escherichia, Acetobacter, and Shigella for mixed acid, Propionibacterium for propionic fermentation, Enterobacter and Klebsiella for butadiol, and Clostridium for the butyric acid pathway.
Lactic acid fermentation is probably the simplest of the fermentation pathways. There are some microorganisms, like the lactobacillus species that we find in yogurt, that simply convert pyruvic acid to lactic acid. The lactic acid in many dairy products gives that dairy product its kind of tangy, distinctive flavor that is a desirable flavor in many foods. Ethanol and mixed acid fermentation pathways are often competing with one another. 2 distinctly different groups of microorganisms will undergo these different pathways. Yeast can often take pyruvic acid manufactured from fruit juices and convert that pyruvic acid into ethyl alcohol or ethanol, which is the drinkable alcohol, and carbon dioxide. If the wrong kinds of microorganisms get into our fruit mash that we're trying to use to manufacture, let's say, wine, then those bacteria instead, along with making ethanol, will also produce a variety of weak organic acids like succinic acid, acetic acid, which is vinegar, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen gas. So that instead of making wine, if the wrong microorganisms get into our fruit juice, we make wine vinegar instead. Two additional fermentation pathways would include propionic acid fermentation and butadiol fermentation. Propionic acid fermentation, there are different kinds of microorganisms that use this pathway, convert pyruvic acid into propionic acid, acetic acid, and carbon dioxide. Many of the special kinds of bacteria that are used in the manufacture of Swiss cheese, and possibly even some fungi, use this particular pathway. If you've ever had Swiss cheese, you know there's a very distinctive flavor. Some people like it, some people don't. But that distinctive Swiss cheese flavor and smell is due to the propionic acid. If you've ever had a well-aged Swiss cheese, you'll also notice it has a little bit of a vinegary smell or even a tangy taste. That too is due to these 2 organic acids manufactured in the cheese. The butadiene pathway is a distinctly separate pathway with much different kinds of end products. The butadiene pathway can lead to the production of butanediol and carbon dioxide. But there's also another end product in the butanediol pathway called acetone. And acetone can be detected in a test called a Voges-Proskauer test. We will perform the Voges-Proskauer test later in the semester in lab. And that test is trying to detect a butanediol fermentation end product called acetone. Many of the butanediol pathway products, in addition to the ones mentioned, are used in manufacturing, things like acrylic paints. So industries and manufacturing often use these fermentation pathway end products. The last of the 6 fermentation pathways is butyric acid. Butyric acid is one of those weak organic acids that certain types of microorganisms, like Clostridium, can convert pyruvic acid to butyric acid, also butylic acid, an alcohol called butanol, and isopropanol, acetone, which is fingernail polish, and carbon dioxide. Now you might recognize the isopropyl alcohol. Isopropanol is rubbing alcohol. Acetone, which is essentially the ingredient in fingernail polish remover, both of these are organic solvents that are routinely used in industry and manufacturing. So the butyric acid fermentation pathway leads to lots of products that are used and useful in everyday activities. But notice the photo is of feet darkened by gangrene, where the growth of these microorganisms like Clostridium in tissue and all of these solvents and acids that are produced by butyric acid fermentation actually lead to some of the destruction of those tissues and the clinical symptom of gangrene. One memory aid that might help to remember at least the names of the different fermentation pathways, and then of course the challenge is to remember the end products that are unique for each pathway, is to think of a sandwich that you're making with lamb and peanut butter. Now granted, no one would really probably do that, but it certainly sounds memorable, doesn't it? I mean, lamb and peanut butter? Well, whatever kind of memory aid might help, please do take time to get familiar and to be able to match the different end products for the different fermentation pathways with each particular pathway. That too will be something that we need to know for exam 2. As the mash of chocolate or cacao seeds along with the fermented pulp continue to ferment, after about 5 days, the fermented mash of seeds and pulp contain about 10 to the 8th microbes per gram of material. The cacao beans are then dried, and as they dry, molds, such as geotrichum, continue to grow and start to oxidize the lactic acid to acetic acid and succinic acid. These weak organic acids modify the texture of the cacao beans or seeds and are going to lead to the very distinctive tastes or flavors of the chocolate seed or the chocolate that's produced once the cacao seeds are dried, ground up, and then continue to be processed to make the chocolate that we now enjoy.
So that change from one population of bacteria or microorganism to another is called microbial or ecological succession. And these types of changes from one population to another is typically what we see in nature and we take advantage of in manufacturing food.